Today we see the decline of the West in several areas with an enormous intensity and speed. The Western world lost not only its moral high ground, but also its soft power, its attraction. The opposite term that should be used in this regard is Europe. And Europe is something quite different than the West. I indeed think that Western civilization and European civilization are quite different concepts in a lot of aspects. Where the troops stopped, the West stopped as well. North Korea was not part of the West, South Korea was. And the same in regard to Germany. East Germany was not part of the West, West Germany was. And they are all united just by one factor: American dominance, American hegemony. What we are calling the West today is basically the American interpretation of the European culture. And the European Union was the attempt to create a kind of copy of the United States in Europe. Or look on the banknotes of Europe. Maybe I have one in my pocket. It's very telling. So we have here, this is a €5 note. And you see here a kind of building. This building does not exist. It's a fantasy. Also, this bridge does not exist. It's an artificial bridge which was just imagined by some painter. So Europe has such a negative relationship to its own history and culture that we cannot even represent our own architecture on our banknotes. In the European history, Europe was strong in peace times and weak in war times. And with the United States, it's the opposite. The United States is strong in war times and weak in peace times. If Europe stays in the condition it is now, it will become an insignificant part of the world. It will not play a role as annex of the United States. Thank you very much. Thank you for the interview, for the invitation. My name is Hauke Ritz. I'm an independent researcher and author and publicist. And for more than 15 years, I'm engaged in the understanding and analysis of German-Russian and Western-Russian relations. This dates back to the year of 2007, when I started to realize that there will be in the future a strong geopolitical confrontation, if not even war, between the United States and Russia. And once you have understood this, it is hard to find any topic that is more important. So it took over to some extent my life, and I started to visit Russia, to learn the Russian language, and to try to research the deep causes of this conflict, which is to some extent a mystery. First of all, I did not refer to Oswald Spengler in the book because I think the decline we are seeing today is a much different kind of decline back then. Also, at that time, the West, as we know today, did not really exist. I just would like to mention that today we see the decline of the West in several areas with an enormous intensity and speed, and you get the impression that the situation is really accelerating year by year, month by month, and it becomes very visible if you compare the current situation with the year 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. At that time, the most part of Eastern Europe and even of the Soviet republics, of the Soviet Union, were attracted by the West, by its products, by its music, by its lifestyle, by its model of civilization. And the same was true to a lot of countries in the South, in the global South, and in the East. And the West at that time was the only manifestation of modernity in the world after the Soviet Union had collapsed and the system of socialist states resolved. And the West had a kind of monopoly on modernity, on the interpretation of the modern world, and everybody wanted to connect it to this world, be it to movies, be it to products, be it by migrating to a Western country. And the West also had the image of democracy, of a just and wealthy and prosperous society, of innovation. And now look at the West today, for what it is standing. for sanctions, for war, for strange ideologies like the LGBT movement, which causes shaking heads, not only in the global South and East, but also in the West itself. So the Western world lost not only its moral high ground, but also its soft power, its attraction. It's also no longer the only interpretation of modernity. We see now a modern China. We start to see a modern India, and also Russia has returned as a great civilization. So the West is now in a quite different state, and the loss of attraction of the status as a model for civilization is, I think, something very severe, which cannot be repaired in a short amount of time. And that's true. What I just now used all the time, the word West. Of course, the opposite term that should be used in this regard is Europe. And Europe is something quite different than the West. Oh, there are a lot of differences. I indeed think that Western civilization and European civilization are quite different concepts, in a lot of aspects different. First of all, the West is something quite new. How long does the West really exist? The West, as we know today, first emerged after the Second World War. And back then it was basically the American zone of influence, which was created by military expansion during the Second World War. And where the troops stopped, the West stopped as well. North Korea was not part of the West, South Korea was. And the same in regard to Germany. East Germany was not part of the West, West Germany was. So the accidental movements during the war created a zone of influence which became the name West. Of course, you can make the argument, no, the West is older. It's the West European states which had revolutions, French Revolution, British, English Revolution, the Netherlands and so forth. Yeah, but these were also not only the countries which had revolution, it were also the countries who had colonies, created in overseas empires. And maybe this is even related. If you have huge trade over the seas, you have a lot of merchants which start to compete with the aristocracy, and then you are more likely to have a revolution. But these early stages of the West were not united. There was a lot of competition between them. Only in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, we see that this competition start to transform itself into a kind of alliance. For example, the Entente Cordiale between Great Britain and France. Later, the alliance between Great Britain and the United States. And this may be a kind of embryo state of the West which we know today. But the West in general is not more than 100 years old. So it's a very young entity, and it contains on the one side North America, on the other side the Europe today of the European Union, which also includes Slavic states like Poland, and then you have South Korea and Taiwan and Japan. So from a cultural perspective, these are quite different countries, quite different areas of the world influenced by different religions, and they are all united just by one factor: American dominance, American hegemony. So at the end you come to the conclusion the West is basically this: American hegemony. There's a lack of a cultural foundation, there's a lack of history. And Europe, in contrast to that, is something quite different. Europe is 2,500 years old. Europe started in ancient Greece with the model of democracy, and democracy also returns to Europe in the modern time with the French Revolution and other revolutions. But in between, there's a long period where Europe has quite different models of government and a different way to organize its society. So Europe is an entity that is not that has a large history, which quite different eras and epochs, but nevertheless there is something that can describe this whole time of more than 2,000 years. And the term of Europe is therefore much more complex and has much more depth than the term of the notion of the West. Of course, to Europe also belongs Western Europe, and Western Europe is the part of Europe that started to have colonies, expanded overseas, and became later on the West. So maybe some Western aspects belong also to Europe, but Europe is much more. The center of Europe, Germany, Italy, they usually are not seen as part of the West. They had not these huge overseas empires for centuries. They're more organized in a decentralized manner. And then you have the Slavic peoples in the East. So Europe is all of this, and the notion West suggests that there is only one model for this whole realm and the whole history of Europe. Europe is also defined by its achievements in the field of arts and literature and music and philosophy. It's also defined by Christianity and the history of Christianity. It's also defined by the reference to the ancient times, so the memory of the culture of ancient Greece and ancient Rome that is common for all European states, and which created a kind of unified realm of knowledge and reference for all European states. For example, through the language of Latin and the ancient Greece language. So there's much more to Europe than to the West, and also in regard of the concept of world order, there's a huge difference. The United States is protected by two oceans. They never can be hurt by anybody, and if they conduct a war on another shore, they can be sure that there will be no repercussions for them. Nothing will come back to them, and this was not the case in Europe. Europe had, over the time of its existence, tremendous wars, and one of the most brutal periods of European history were the times of the 30 Years' Wars in the 17th century, which took place in Germany at that time, but there were also civil wars at the same time in other European states. And what Europe learned from this war is that you cannot have wars and foreign policy over values. If you start to make the issue of Catholicism and Protestantism to a part of your foreign policy, to the part of your national expansion, then you have never-ending wars. And therefore, after this war, the Westphalian system was created, where these young nation-states learned to respect their differences, to respect that every state has the right to govern in its own domestic affairs, and that there shouldn't be an influence from the outside, and that every state has is in the same manner a subject of the international law, despite its number of population and its strength. And this was a quite huge civilizational achievement, which of course in the centuries that followed from time to time was lost again. But it was a quite different concept of world order, a world order that accepts multipolarity, that accepts the simultaneous existence of several powers which don't interfere in each other, which are able to reflect on the otherness of the other. And the United States have a totally different concept of world order. First of all, they think that they are somehow chosen by God, that they have a manifest destiny given to them by God, that they, the concept of manifest destiny means that they think that they only can become stronger and stronger and stronger, and that they therefore have the task to lead the world, and therefore they have no. The American policy, the whole history of American foreign policy is defined by the fact that they cannot be partners. They cannot create a partnership to somebody else because they always think they are above the others. They always think that they have the better system than the others. And that's why the Americans have, till today, problems to create a contract, for example, with Russia or with China, to which they really stick to. Because they always think the other nations, the other states, they don't have the same kind of democracy we have, therefore the people there are suppressed. Therefore, the contract we are now making is just for some time. Because the state with which we make this contract is not as developed as we are, is not in the same manner chosen as we are. This is basically a tragedy that due to this concept of manifest destiny, exceptionalism, the concept of indispensable nation, the United States couldn't create partnerships, a partnership with Europe, with Germany, with France, with Italy. Instead, transformed Europe slowly but surely into a kind of colonial status. And this is also a tragedy for America itself, because if Europe would be a partner for the United States, Europe could positively influence the United States. And we could prevent a lot of mistakes American foreign policy did in the Middle East, for example, or in regard to Russia. But because America didn't saw Europe as a partner, they never learned anything from us. They always pretended they already know everything. And this led to a foreign policy which antagonized large parts of the world. The United States now have a conflicting relationship not only to Russia, which is already has entered the state of war, but also to China, also to Iran, more and more to Turkey, to the Arab world, where they conducted tremendous wars and destruction, also to Africa and Latin America. So there's really no realm of civilization in the world to which the United States have a normal relationship, not even to India. And this is quite self-destructive for the United States, because by antagonizing every other big nation or civilization in the world, the United States have basically created a kind of counter-alliance. The BRICS are created by the United States. The United States built BRICS, even if they didn't intend it to do so, but BRICS is basically the child of the foreign policy of the United States. I think the Soviet Union would have liked to have returned to the system, because the Soviet Union was already a very big country, and to control even more states out of the Soviet Union was a burden for the Soviet Union, especially if you see the huge destruction the Second World War has caused in the most populated parts of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union had not really the interest to control large parts of Europe, and for sure not whole of Europe. So that could explain why, for example, in the year 1953, the Soviet Union made the offer that they would remove their forces out of Germany for neutrality, that Germany can be reunited if it is neutral, like Austria. But this offer was rejected by the West German government and also by the United States, who had the interest to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. This is a famous quote of Lord Ismay, the first head of NATO after the Second World War. And but now the Americans were there, and for them, Europe was a kind of Gegenküste, we say it in German, the opposite shore, I don't know the English word. So for the United States as a sea power, it was very important that they controlled the opposite shore of the ocean, and this was Europe. And they wanted to stay there. They saw in their mentality saw their presence in Europe as a kind of trophy or victory, and because they had the impression that they have the better system, and the United States was populated by Europe, by people who fled Europe because of political suppression or religious suppression. And that's why many Americans till today have a negative impression of Europe. Europe is for them the place that is not as free and not as democratic as they are. And by returning to Europe after the Second World War meant for them now to correcting Europe. And they had not really, of course there are some Americans who have admiration for the European art and literature and philosophy, but in general they look more down on Europe than they respect Europe. And for them it was no problem to remodel, to readjust European culture. And also they wanted to unify the place, to create a kind of alliance against the Soviet Union. And because the United States saw themselves as an exceptional nation with a manifest destiny, they couldn't accept that there's another nation like the Soviet Union who has also a kind of project and of socialism and an idea for mankind. So, and for the Soviet Union, of course, the presence of the Americans on the European continent was a danger, because Russia has for several centuries always made the experience that they can live in peace with Europe if there is this equilibrium of power. But once in a while, Europe unites, for example, under Napoleon, and then attacks Russia. Or Europe unites through the conquest of Hitler and Nazi Germany, and then attacks Russia. And now the presence of the Americans on the European continent was once again a kind of unification of Europe under American rule. And this inherits the danger from the viewpoint of Moscow that they can once again be attacked. That's the reason why they had to be present in Eastern Europe, even so they not really wanted it. I just said Europe was always organized as an equilibrium of power. And that means that Europe becomes unstable if there is one power ruling Europe. It's not good for Europe. It's also not good. Germany is maybe the strongest country in Europe, but not strong enough to rule Europe alone. And that's the beauty of Europe, that Europe has these many states, and some of them are equal strong. France and Germany, Britain, Italy, Spain, they are similar big, and they balance each other. And so I think Europe can only be governed in such a balance. Between which countries this balance, this equilibrium takes place may differ from century to century. During the time of the European Union, we had the French-German axis, which was a way to rebuild or to replicate this balance. And furthermore, because of the legacy of the Second World War, Germany is not very loved in the rest of Europe. So Germany has friends. Germany is very much respected in China, in Japan, in Russia. If you are far away from Germany, Germany is respected. But if you are in the countries nearby Germany, in Poland, in France, in Great Britain, Germany is not so much respected. So for all these reasons, Germany cannot unify Europe and cannot govern Europe and should not govern Europe. Europe should be organize itself in this balance of similar strong powers if peace is possible. In the very moment the European states or Europe as a whole understands its own interest, it will very quickly start to organize a peace with Russia, because this is in Europe's interest. If you look in the European history, Europe was strong in peace times and weak in war times. And with the United States, it's the opposite. The United States is strong in war times and weak in peace times. And so Europe needs peace. Furthermore, Russia is a part of Europe. So if we speak about Europe, we automatically speak also about Russia. And if we exclude Russia from Europe, it's like if you would exclude a big traditional province from China. or an important province from India. So the unity of the continent, which is can be shown on the map geographically, but also culturally. Pushing Russia out of Europe would mean, for example, to push large achievement of classical music out of Europe. Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, or literature, or philosophy, or the legacy of socialism, which is also part of Europe. The whole history of Eastern Europe during the Cold War, all this is connected to Russia. So Europe can only be healthy and can only have a future if it includes the whole of Europe. And a Europe that excludes Russia will be ill, divided, and probably not in a very will not have sovereignty over its own cultural development. And to some extent, these idea that Europe is organized in an equilibrium of similar powerful states is a concept that very much represents the concept of BRICS, of the multipolar world, which also consists out of similar strong states like China, India, Russia, which are totally different to each other, but agree in specific ideas about the organization of the world order. Today, what we are calling the West today is basically the American interpretation of the European culture. The American culture has still European origins, but it has become something different. And these half European, half not European culture from the United States has come back to Europe after the Second World War and has started to transform Europe, to remake Europe in the image of the United States. And the European Union was the attempt to create a kind of copy of the United States in Europe. Constitution of Europe was planned more than 20 years ago. Some people wanted to write in a quote of Pericles, the famous ancient Greek politician. And later on, the quote was removed because it was not politically correct. And Pericles had maybe said something wrong about some minorities, and they couldn't accept Pericles any longer. And therefore, the quote was removed. This shows you the relationship of the European Union to the history of Europe. Or look on the banknotes of Europe. Maybe I have one in my pocket. It's very telling. So we have here, this is a €5 note. And you see here a kind of building. This building does not exist. It's a fantasy. Also, this bridge does not exist. It's an artificial bridge which was just imagined by some painter. So Europe has such a negative relationship to its own history and culture that we cannot even represent our own architecture on our banknotes. Within the European Union, we have a lot of dependency. So if you resolve the European Union, it would be as catastrophic like the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which created a lot of poverty and civil wars. And so nobody wants that. Of course, the European Union needs at least a kind of remake. It has to be reformed fundamentally. I don't know if this is possible. Of course, if the European Union really falls apart, this also can become a very ugly process because the economic ramifications are huge. But the concept of civilizational state is a very interesting concept or a very interesting term. The question is, can Europe be a civilizational state? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, it can, because in the whole history of Europe, Europe was somehow united. After the downfall of the Roman Empire, Europe was politically divided, but culturally united through the church and through the Christian belief, and also through the monasteries that were created in many different parts of Europe, which all try to remember the ancient history and the ancient literature and writings. And this was this continued for 1,500 years, that Europe was united either through Christianity, through religion, through the church, or later on through the philosophy of humanism and the Enlightenment and the exchange of literature. Maybe we will see in the future also a Chinese world culture, or an Indian world culture, or an Islamic world culture. I don't exclude this. I would welcome this. But this will take time. Because if you want to transform your regional culture into a world culture, you have to create art. We have to write books. You have to create a philosophy, music that can be attractive for other people in other parts of the world. And this cannot be done in one generation. This cannot even be done in 2 generations. It needs time. And Europe has already done this the last 300, 400 years. And this is a kind of heritage, not only for Europe, but also for the world, and should be protected. And that's why Europe should be sovereign, should be independent, should be an independent pole in the multipolar world, and not a kind of annex of the United States, not a kind of American colony which sees itself with American lenses and has a kind of colonial consciousness like it is unfortunately today. Germany can be one pole within a multipolar Europe, of course, like France, like Italy, like other important states and regions. And should also be such a pole. And of course, currently, the current crisis, Germany is affected the most by the war in Ukraine, for example. The high energy prices have caused a kind of deindustrialization in Germany. So we start to feel it. Usually, Germany is not a place where active revolutions take place. Our revolutions, we had the German Peasants' War or the Revolution of 1918 with Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, they always failed. If a revolution took place in Germany, it was a political revolution. Of course, you can say fascism was a kind of political revolution which was quite ugly and which is, of course, not something we want to refer to. But maybe there is also a kind, if you look back in history, there were spiritual or mental revolutions coming from Germany. For example, Martin Luther introduced the idea of Protestantism, of a reform of the church, which was also a kind of revolution. But this was something more mental, not an active political revolution. The same was true with the idea of socialism, which is also rooted in the German history of idea. Marx, in the end, was a German philosopher. So maybe in this sense, something can come out of Europe, maybe out of Germany. Maybe some Germans could offer an idea. But I think the other European states are as important. France is important with its legacy of revolution, of demonstration. Italy is important. The East European states are important. I think in the end, we will see that from several corners of Europe, something comes. From the one part comes an idea, from the other part comes political upheaval, from another part of Europe is able to conduct a reasonable reform, and in the end it will contribute and help each other. But we are now at a crossroad. Either if Europe stay in the condition it is now, it will become an insignificant part of the world. It will not play a role as annex of the United States. It will be its wealth will decline, its population will probably also decline, or the European societies will lose their coherence and their identity, and Europe would become an insignificant and poor part of the world. A lot of wealth still in Europe. So there are forces that can do something, and I think these processes are already underway. And I cannot see in the future, I cannot describe to you how this change will look like. Maybe it will come in a surprising way. Like the change of 1989 came in a surprising way. A lot of people thought the wall will be standing there for the next 20 years, and suddenly overnight it disappeared. So history cannot be totally foreseen. History is always a surprise. And if we have an imagination of the future, we can be sure that this imagination will not manifest itself to 100%. History is always different than we thought. And, but I'm sure that so much is at stake now. 2,500 years of history, 2,500 years of rising cultural complexity, of developing civilization. This shouldn't be all for nothing. Europe is important, not only for Europe, but also for the world. And I think a Europe that would stick once again to its tradition of history, literature, philosophy, would be respected in the world, even so we have this legacy of colonial atrocities. But nevertheless, there are always two sides. And so I see a future for a cultural, intellectual, consciousness Europe, and maybe it is possible.